In 1952, on dirt ovals all across America, the same strange thing kept happening. The green flag would drop. The big, favored V8s would thunder away into the lead. But then, a boxy little sedan riding low, running 6 cylinders and a 2-barrel carburetor would quietly reel them in one by one and drive off into the distance. It happened 27 times in a single season. It happened so often that rival teams stopped calling it luck and started calling it a problem that needed to be fixed. This is the true story of the Hudson Hornet and the 308 engine that terrified Detroit. And the truth about what really killed it is stranger than the legend you've been told. Act 1. The company that couldn't afford to win. To understand why the 308 matters, you have to understand how badly the odds were stacked against it. The year is 1951. America is drunk on horsepower. The war is over, money is flowing, and Detroit is starting an arms race measured in pistons and cubic inches. At the top of that race sit the giants. General Motors, with the money to build anything. Chrysler, cooking up its legendary overhead valve Hemi V8. Ford, the company that put the world on wheels. These are the heavyweights, and every one of them is betting the future on the V8 engine. And then there's Hudson, the Hudson Motor Car Company based right there in Detroit, Michigan on Jefferson Avenue. Hudson is old, proud, and small. It does not have General Motors money. It does not have a modern V8, and it cannot afford to design one from scratch to chase the giants. For a company like Hudson, one wrong bet could be the end. Think about the fear inside a company like that. General Motors could lose a fortune on a bad idea and shrug it off by Friday. Hudson could not. Every dollar Hudson spent on engineering was a dollar it might never see again. When you are that small, you cannot afford to be wrong even once. And the safe, sensible, cowardly move would have been to build a cheap, ordinary car, keep your head down, and hope to survive. So Hudson does something that looks, on paper, like surrender. Instead of building a V8, the engineers double down on the one thing they already do better than almost anyone, the big inline 6-cylinder engine. But make no mistake, this was not cowardice. It was defiance. While the rest of the industry sprinted toward the overhead valve V8 because it was fashionable, Hudson's engineers made a cold, contrarian bet. They looked at what actually wins on the street and on a racetrack, and they decided the crowd was chasing the wrong thing. They decided that torque, low down, delivered by a simple, bulletproof engine, would beat horsepower up high, delivered by something fragile and expensive. It was one of the great engineering gambles of the decade, and almost nobody outside Detroit even noticed it was happening. They take their existing 6, and they make it enormous. They bore the cylinders out. They stretch the stroke all the way to 4.5 inches, and when they're done, they have a Flathead inline 6 displacing 308 cubic inches. 308. At the time, that is the largest 6-cylinder engine in any mass-produced American car. To put that in perspective, Chevrolet's 6 was 235 cubic inches, and people already thought that was big. Now here is the choice that made engineers at other companies laugh out loud. Hudson kept it a flathead, a side valve engine, an L-head, with the valves down in the block instead of overhead valves up in the cylinder head. In 1951, overhead valves were the shiny new future. Flatheads were yesterday's technology. So why would Hudson deliberately build something everyone else was walking away from? Because a flathead is simple. It is cheap to build. It is easy to fix, and done right, it makes smooth, relentless, low-down power. Hudson didn't need an engine that screamed at high RPM. Hudson needed an engine that pulled hard from just off idle and never quit. And that is exactly what the 308 did. It made around 275 pound-feet of torque low in the rev range, and it made it while hauling a heavy car without complaint. The block was cast from a tough chrome alloy iron, and it earned a reputation for being close to indestructible. Owners would swear their engines ran 200,000 miles without ever cracking the block open. Racers, we're told, took one look at that heavy, stout casting and started calling it the anvil. Whether or not that nickname was ever official, it captured the truth. This was not a delicate engine. This was a hammer. And that toughness wasn't an accident. It was the whole strategy. A racing engine has one great enemy: heat and stress over a long, brutal afternoon. The V8s of the early 1950s were powerful, but many of them were young designs, and young designs break. Hudson's Flathead 6 had been evolving for years. The bottom end was a forged steel crankshaft, balanced and heavy, spinning in an iron block thick enough to shrug off punishment that would have split lesser engines wide open. On a 500-mile race over a rutted dirt track, the fastest car in the world means nothing if it's sitting in the infield with a hole in the block. Hudson's engine didn't just make power, it finished, every single time. Here's the physics of why it worked in plain language. A long-stroke engine like the 308 with its 4.5-inch stroke is built to make torque, that low, twisting, shoving force you feel the instant you touch the throttle. High-revving engines make their power way up at the top, where you have to wind them out and keep them screaming. But a heavy car clawing out of a slick dirt corner doesn't want a scream. It wants a shove. It wants that wall of torque right off idle, so the tires bite and the car launches instead of spinning helplessly. The 308 delivered exactly that. It was, in a sense, the wrong engine for a drag strip and the perfect engine for a fight in the dirt. In standard trim with a single carburetor, the 308 made about 145 horsepower. That doesn't sound like much today, but in 1951, that number went toe-to-toe with the early V8s, including the celebrated Oldsmobile Rocket 88. A family sedan from a small company was matching the muscle of the industry's proudest new engines. Detroit noticed. Detroit was not worried yet, but Detroit noticed. Act 2. The secret weapon wasn't the engine. Here's what most people get wrong about the Hudson Hornet. They think the whole story is the engine. It isn't, because Hudson had a second weapon, and in some ways it was even more important than the 308. It was the way the car was built. Back in 1948, Hudson had introduced something it called the step-down design. Instead of bolting the body on top of the frame, Hudson dropped the floor pan down inside the frame rails, so passengers stepped down into the car. It sounds like a small thing. It was revolutionary, because dropping the floor dropped the car's center of gravity down toward the road. And a low center of gravity is the single best thing you can give a car that has to go around corners fast. While the tall, top-heavy competition leaned, slid, and fishtailed through the turns, the Hornet stayed flat and planted. It cornered like nothing else on the road, and it did it at a time when almost every other American car handled like a rowboat in a storm. Understand how radical that was. In 1951, most American cars were built like tall boxes bolted onto a ladder frame. They rode high, they wallowed, and in a hard corner all that weight lurched to the outside like a passenger sliding across a bench seat. The Hudson did the opposite. By burying the passengers down inside the frame rails, Hudson had, almost by accident, built the closest thing America had to a sports sedan. A full-sized family car that could be thrown into a corner and would simply obey. Engineers today would tell you that low center of gravity is worth more than 100 extra horsepower on a twisty track. Hudson had it a decade before anyone else took it seriously. Now put the two pieces together. Take a chassis that corners better than anything in America. Bolt in an engine making a wall of low-end torque. What you have built, almost by accident, is the perfect stock car. Nobody at Hudson fully understood that yet. One man on the outside was about to. But first, Hudson turned up the wick. In 1952, they offered an option that would become legend. They called it twin H-power. The idea was beautifully simple. Instead of one carburetor, bolt on two. Two single-barrel Carter carburetors on a dual intake manifold, each one feeding its own bank of cylinders, doubling the breathing of the engine. There was real engineering brains in that simplicity. Two carburetors meant each one only had to feed half the engine, so each bank of cylinders got a cleaner, fuller gulp of fuel and air. More air in, more fuel in, more power out. without stressing the tough old Flathead one bit. It was the kind of clever, low-cost trick a company invents when it can't afford to invent anything expensive. At first, buyers had to have twin H-Power fitted at the dealership, but once word spread, demand exploded, and Hudson made it a proper factory option. It cost only a modest sum on top of the car, pocket change for what it did. Twin H-Power lifted the 308 to around 170 horsepower, and with that, a six-cylinder Hudson sedan became one of the fastest production cars in the entire country, nudging up toward 100 miles per hour. Read that again. In the golden age of the American V8, the quickest thing in many a showroom was a Flathead 6 from a company that couldn't afford a V8. Picture the scene at a stoplight in 1952. A driver in a shiny new V8 glances over at the boxy Hudson next to him and, because everybody knows a 6 is no match for an 8. The light turns green, and then the Hudson is simply gone, pulling away in a wave of torque, its driver not even trying very hard. That little moment of disbelief played out on streets all over America. The Hornet didn't look fast. That was the whole joke. It just was. It was, in every sense, a David built to fight Goliaths, and Hudson was about to send it into the ring. Act 3. The Man Who Saw It First. Every great underdog story needs someone who believes before the world does. For the Hudson Hornet, that man was Marshall Teague. Teague was a racer out of Daytona Beach, Florida, so fast and so at home on that treacherous sand and pavement beach course that they called him the King of the Beach. He was also sharp, business-minded, and always watching for an edge. When Teague got behind the wheel of a Hornet, he felt something the marketing men had missed. He felt that low, planted chassis. He felt the torque. And he understood in his bones that this odd little car could win races. So Marshall Teague did something almost nobody did in 1951. He walked into Hudson and pitched them on going racing, officially, with factory support. This was radical because at the time, no American manufacturer openly, seriously backed a stock car team. Racing was seen as grubby, dangerous, and beneath a respectable car company. But Hudson was small, hungry, and desperate for attention it couldn't buy with advertising money. And so, Hudson said yes. In doing so, it became one of the very first automakers to put real factory muscle behind a NASCAR effort. Teague built his cars, tuned them to a razor's edge, and half-jokingly called them Teague-mobiles. And this is a bigger deal than it sounds. Factory support meant Hudson would quietly funnel its best parts, its engineering knowledge, and its blessing to the men racing its cars. It meant the severe usage components, the tougher, race-ready pieces, could find their way onto the track through the back door. In an era when manufacturers pretended they had nothing to do with racing, Hudson was all in, and it gave Teague and the others a weapon the privateers in other brands simply didn't have. A factory that actually wanted them to win. Teague himself was the perfect first believer. He was a racer's racer, but he also thought like a businessman, and he knew that a car company handing him parts and money was worth more than any single trophy. He turned that Hudson relationship into a machine for winning, and the wins came so fast that the rest of the garage had to take notice. And then Hudson stacked a deck. Around Teague came a roster of the hardest chargers in the young sport. There was Herb Thomas, a soft-spoken North Carolina farm boy who drove like the devil in the number 92 car that the world would come to know as the fabulous Hudson Hornet. There was Tim Flock, one of the fearless racing Flock brothers, smooth and lightning fast. There was Dick Rathman, Frank Mundy, Al Keller, Lou Figaro, a murderer's row of talent, all pointed at the same target. And tuning some of those engines in the early days was a young mechanic who would become the most famous wrench in racing history. Smokey Yunick, out of Daytona Beach, the man behind the best damn garage in town. Yunick understood the 308 better than almost anyone alive. He knew it didn't live up high in the RPM range like the V8s, He knew it lived down low, where it pulled and pulled and pulled, like a locomotive leaning into a grade. On a slick dirt track where too much power just spun the tires, that endless, controllable low-end grunt was worth more than raw horsepower. It was the perfect weapon for the wrong-looking car. And here's the thing about that low-end power on a dirt track. Traction is everything. On loose, slippery dirt, a car with too much sudden horsepower just lights up its rear tires and sits there spinning, going nowhere in a cloud of dust. But a car with smooth, endless torque can feed the power in gently and hook up, driving forward while the flashy cars are still fighting themselves. The 308 was almost tailor-made for it. Where the V8s wasted their muscle spinning the tires, the Hudson put its muscle on the ground. That is the secret sauce, the reason a slow 6 kept beating fast 8s, race after race after race. The pieces were in place: the chassis, the engine, the drivers, the genius mechanic, and a factory quietly slipping them everything they needed. Now all they had to do was go out and shock the world. Nobody, not Ford, not General Motors, not even Hudson itself, had any idea just how badly the shock was about to land. Act 4. The season that broke the rule book. What happened next didn't just win races. It rewrote what people thought was possible. Start with the number that still makes racing historians blink. In 1952, the top NASCAR division ran 34 races. The Hudson Hornet won 27 of them. 27 wins out of 34 starts. That is not a good season. That is a massacre. Tim Flock drove a Hudson to the 1952 championship, and it was Hudson's world. Everyone else was just racing for the scraps. And it wasn't only that they won, it was how they won. Race after race, the Hornets didn't just beat the V8s, they embarrassed them. There were events where Hudsons swept the podium, crossing the line first, second, and third, while the crowd stood in disbelief and the mighty 8-cylinder cars of Ford and General Motors coughed home behind them. The recipe was the same every time. On the straights, the V8s could sometimes edge ahead. But then came the corner, and in the corner, physics changed sides. While the tall cars slid wide and scrambled for grip, the low Hornet simply drove around the outside or dove underneath, that step-down chassis holding the line, that fat torque curve firing the car off the turn before its rivals had even finished sliding. Drivers described the Hornet as a car that didn't slide through a corner so much as crouch down and stick to it. Think about what that did to the men in the other pits. You have spent a fortune building a powerful, modern V8. You have the biggest names in Detroit behind you, and every single weekend, you get beaten by a family sedan with a Flathead 6, built by a company you barely consider a competitor. It is not just losing, it is humiliation. And humiliation in racing breeds resentment. The whispers started early. Some of the beaten teams didn't call it good engineering. They called it an unfair advantage. They started muttering that something about the Hudson wasn't quite right. Too big, too favored, too hard to beat. Nobody could prove a thing because there was nothing to prove. The Hudson was simply better suited to the job. But resentment doesn't need proof. It just needs a target. And the Hornet was the biggest target in the sport. Herb Thomas became the face of it all. He had already won the 1951 championship, and in 1953 he did it again, making him a two-time champion in the fabulous Hudson Hornet. In 1953, the Hornets piled up more than 20 wins, and the phrase, "the fabulous Hudson Hornet," stopped being a slogan and became a fact of life. Hudson slapped it on brochures, on posters, on dealership windows. For a company that had been an afterthought, it was the greatest advertising it had ever had, and it was all true. For 2 straight years, the Hornet owned NASCAR. Not let it, owned it. The championship, the wins, the podium sweeps, the headlines. A car that shouldn't have been able to compete at all had turned the entire sport into its personal playground. And in racing, when you dominate like that, you learn a hard lesson very quickly. You are no longer the plucky underdog everyone roots for. You are the empire everyone wants to see fall. But behind the trophies, in the back rooms of the Hudson race shop, the engineers were building something they didn't put in the brochures, something meaner. And this is where the story turns dark. Its name was the 7X. The 7X was the 308 taken to its absolute limit. It was never a normal production engine you could just walk in and buy off a showroom floor. It began life as a severe usage engine, the kind of thing built for police cars and brutal high-altitude duty. But racers and hot rodders got wind of it, and they wanted it. So Hudson made it available the quiet way, special order, built up and installed through the dealer, one at a time. And these engines were hand-built in every sense. Hudson fitted larger valves, around 2 inches on the intake side. Technicians hand-machined the ports for better airflow and hand-shaped the metal around the valves. They hand-picked thick, strong engine blocks that could take the abuse. They raised the compression using a cylinder head borrowed from a smaller engine, and Hudson kept refining the camshaft season after season. Every piston, every bearing, every crankshaft was chosen and installed by hand. For its era, the 7X was about as precise and as serious as a high-performance engine could get. Stop and appreciate how strange that is. In an age of gleaming, mass-produced V8s rolling off automated lines by the thousand, Hudson's ultimate weapon was the opposite of mass production. It was a handcrafted, one-at-a-time, blueprinted engine, built by people who knew each part intimately. 2 engines might wear the same name and be subtly, meaningfully different, because a human being had made 100 tiny decisions building each one. It was less like a factory product and more like a hand-forged sword, rare, expensive, and deadly in the right hands. And that hand-built nature, the very thing that made the 7X so good, would before long become the exact thing that doomed it. Hold that thought. The result was roughly 210 horsepower out of a Flathead 6, and on the track, it turned an already dominant car into something close to unstoppable. In 1953, Herb Thomas took a 7X Hornet to victory at Langhorne Speedway, a vicious, punishing dirt track that chewed up weaker cars and spat them out. The Hornet's chassis clung to the ruts, the 7X hammered it down the straights, and Thomas drove past the V8s as if they were parked. Out in California, hot rodders started grafting 7X parts onto ordinary 308s, building drag strip terrors out of a boxy family sedan. The little company with the old-fashioned engine had, impossibly, built the car to beat. And that was the problem. Because in racing, there is nothing more dangerous than being the car everyone else has to beat. You don't just win races. You paint a target on your own back. Act 5. The Explosive Truth. Now we come to the part of the story where legend and truth split apart. And the truth, once you dig for it, is more explosive than the myth. Here is the myth, the version passed around for 70 years. The story goes that the giants, Ford, General Motors, the V8 establishment, were so humiliated by a 6-cylinder underdog that they went to NASCAR behind closed doors, twisted arms, threatened to walk away, and got the rules rewritten specifically to strangle the Hudson. In this version, the 7X was a threat so terrifying that the powerful buried it in the dark, and somewhere out there, in a forgotten barn, crates of banned Hudson race engines are still hidden to this day. It's a fantastic story, and there is a grain of real conflict buried inside it. But then you look at the documents, and the buried treasure conspiracy starts to fall apart. Because the honest answer to what killed the 308 is, in its own way, far more brutal than any secret cabal. The truth is, nobody had to conspire to kill the Hudson Hornet. The market did it, time did it, and a merger finished the job. Start with technology. The whole reason the Flathead 6 worked was that, in the early 1950s, The new overhead valve V8s were still young and raw, but the giants were pouring millions into them, and they got good, fast. Chrysler had the fearsome 331 Hemi. In 1955, Chevrolet dropped the 265 small block V8, an engine so good it would define the next 50 years of performance. These new V8s could rev higher, breathe better, and make more power more easily than any Flathead ever could. And crucially, as NASCAR's tracks shifted from slick dirt over to smooth pavement, the game changed. On pavement, you can use high RPM horsepower. The Hornet's beautiful low-end torque advantage, the thing that won all those dirt track corners, mattered less and less. The clock was running out on the Flathead, and no rulebook could stop it. And think about what that shift really meant for Hudson. The Hornet's entire identity, its low-end torque, its cornering, its ability to hook up on a slick surface, was built for a kind of racing that was disappearing. As the sport paved its tracks and chased higher speeds, it slowly, quietly stopped rewarding the exact things the Hudson was best at, and started rewarding the exact things the new V8s were best at. No villain had to do that. The sport simply grew up and grew away from the Flathead 6. The Hudson didn't get slower. The world got faster, in a direction the 308 couldn't follow. Now, the rules did change, and this is where the myth grabs its grain of truth. As NASCAR grew and the big manufacturers got involved, the sanctioning body tightened its rules, displacement limits, and homologation requirements demanding that a manufacturer actually build and sell enough real, street-legal cars with a given engine to make it legal for racing. On paper, that sounds fair. In practice, it is a rule that quietly crushes the small and rewards the huge every single time. And here is where a small company gets crushed without anyone needing to conspire. Chrysler could build thousands of street Hemis to satisfy any homologation rule you cared to write. Hudson could not mass-produce the hand-built 7X. It was too special, too expensive, too low volume. So the 7X, the crown jewel, was effectively locked out of top competition, not by a secret handshake, but by simple math that always favors the big and the rich. And underneath all of it, the deepest truth of all. Hudson was going broke. All those racing trophies never translated into showroom sales. In 1953, Hudson sold only around 36,000 Hornets. That same year, Chevrolet sold well over 1 million cars. Buyers wanted long, low, flashy V8 styling, and the Hornet, for all its speed, was a boxy, aging shape. Hudson was winning on Sunday and losing, badly, every other day of the week. The racing program cost money the company simply did not have. So in 1954, Hudson did what dying companies do. It merged, joining with Nash to form American Motors Corporation, AMC. And that merger was the real death sentence for the 308. The new owners were cutting costs, not chasing checkered flags. The magnificent step-down chassis, the thing that made the Hornet handle like a dream, was expensive to retool and got pushed aside for a cheaper shared platform. Suddenly, a Hudson Hornet could be ordered with a 320 Packard V8 instead of the famous 6. The fabulous Hudson Hornet was slowly turning into a rebadged Nash. There was no smoky room. There was no villain twirling a mustache. The explosive truth is quieter and colder than that. The greatest underdog engine in American racing wasn't assassinated by a conspiracy. It was outspent, out-engineered by the very V8 revolution it had held off for 3 glorious years, and finally smothered by a merger it was too weak to survive. The Giants didn't have to cheat to win. They just had to wait. And somehow, that's a sadder ending than the legend. Act 6. The Last Hornet. By 1957, it was over. The last true Hudson rolled off the line, and the 308 went with it. The engine that had won 27 races in a single season, the engine that made Detroit's Giants look foolish on 100 dirt ovals, was simply discontinued, filed away, gone. And the people who made the legend? Their stories didn't end softly either. Marshall Teague, the king of the beach, the man who had talked Hudson into racing in the first place, eventually fell out with the sport's politics, walked away from stock cars, and chased raw speed elsewhere. In 1959, testing a car at high speed on the Daytona Superspeedway, Marshall Teague was killed. The man who first saw what the Hornet could be never got to see how the legend would live on. Herb Thomas, the two-time champion, the face of the fabulous Hudson Hornet, was badly hurt in a crash in the mid-1950s that effectively ended his frontline career. The Hudson era of NASCAR closed, and the sport charged on into the age of the big V8, the very engine the Hornet had defied. There's a bitter irony in all of it. The 308 was never beaten on merit. No V8 ever proved in its prime that it was simply the better racing engine head-to-head. Instead, the Hornet was retired by a boardroom, its chassis cheapened by cost-cutters, its racing program starved of money, its ultimate engine locked out by rules it couldn't afford to satisfy. The greatest giant killer in American stock car racing didn't lose a fair fight. It was quietly walked off the stage while it was still winning. For decades after, the 308 was a story for old-timers and diehards. A footnote. You had to be there. The world moved on and mostly forgot that the meanest thing on the track in 1952 had 6 cylinders and a flathead. The people who had been there never forgot. But they were getting older, and the legend was fading with them. It looked for a long time like the fabulous Hudson Hornet would simply slip out of memory altogether, remembered by nobody but the faithful few who still wrenched on these strange, wonderful old cars in their garages. And then, in 2006, something wonderful happened. A movie called Cars introduced a character named Doc Hudson, a wise, gruff, retired racing legend, a 1951 Hudson Hornet, voiced by the actor and real-life racer Paul Newman. Overnight, a whole new generation of kids and parents fell in love with a car they'd never heard of. They went home and typed Hudson Hornet into search engines. They found the old race photos. They found the 27 wins. They found the Flathead 6 that beat the V8s. Suddenly, the fabulous Hudson Hornet was fabulous again. Restorations took off. Collectors started hunting down twin H-Power cars and the rare, precious survivors carrying 7X parts. Enthusiasts, right up to famous collectors like Jay Leno, celebrated the engine's stubborn toughness and its unlikely giant-killing history. An engine Detroit had left for dead came roaring back to life in the one place that mattered most, the hearts of the people who loved these machines. And why does it hit so hard, all these years later? Because it's the story we all secretly want to be true. The little guy, outgunned and outfunded, beating the giants with brains and guts instead of money. For 3 seasons on the dirt ovals of America, that fantasy was cold, hard fact, stamped into a chrome alloy block and driven to 27 wins in a single year. The Hudson Hornet is proof that, at least once, the underdog didn't just show up. The underdog won. The little company with the big 6-cylinder had lost the war, but it turned out the legend was bulletproof. Cliffhanger plus what-if ending. So the next time somebody tells you the V8 ruled the 1950s, tell them about the boxy little sedan that beat them all. Tell them about the step-down chassis and twin H-Power. Tell them about the hand-built 7X. Tell them about a broke company from Detroit that, for 3 impossible seasons, made the Giants look slow. But then, lean in and ask the questions nobody can answer. What if Hudson hadn't been so broke? What if that little company had the money to keep developing the 308, to build a modern head, to answer the overhead valve V8 instead of being swallowed by a merger? Does the Hudson Hornet become a legend that lasts for decades? Or was the Flathead always living on borrowed time? And what about those hand-built 7X engines? The special order monsters, built one at a time, never mass-produced. Almost none were ever made. So where did they all go? How many are still out there right now, hidden in a barn, sitting in a crate, waiting? Could one be closer than you think? Here's the real debate. Drop it in the comments and let's argue about it. Was the 308 the greatest giant-killing engine in American racing history? Or was it just an underdog that got lucky for 3 years before the real players showed up? And the big one, did the V8 beat the Hudson Hornet fair and square? Or did the giants just win the way giants always win? By outlasting the little guy who dared to beat them?